us and participate with us. Everything we're seeing on our end says that is happening, and so we're happy for that. We will, as usual, be tracking comments. We would love for you to interact with us to your heart's content, and whatever questions, whatever comments you may have. The more you guys interact, I really think the better that this goes, just because then we're more direct with what you're doing with, what you're thinking. And so that's the plan tonight. We're going to do our follow-up from Sunday morning, where we dealt specifically with anxiety and worry. This series, we've kind of been looking at different lies that contribute to mental health. Your mic's off to the side.
Oh, I was going to speak really loud.
Yeah. Right.
I was going to talk real loud. Okay.
Yeah. So anyways, we've got, we started dealing with a bunch of different lies that contribute negatively to our mental health. And now this past Sunday and then this upcoming Sunday, we're kind of zoning in specifically on a couple aspects that are predominant in mental health conversations right now. Dealing with anxiety last week, we'll deal with depression this upcoming week, which I think is really good. I think there's some really good, healthy conversations happening. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're following up. Again, as usual, make sure you guys make any comments, any questions that you may have as we go through this and as we deal with it. Okay, I want to start with this, just because I think that sometimes when you're in your studies, you're preparing, sometimes things come up that even catch you off guard. And those are always really fun as a preacher, because that's something that you can kind of just, have some energy to just pour into and focus in on. And this was one of them. Within our conversations, talking about worry, we got into a big discussion on Paul and his use of the word anxiety or worry when he's talking about the churches. While he also uses that same word to tell people, don't do this. Don't worry, don't be anxious. But then he talks about it himself. And it led to that interesting conversation about when worry is actually a good thing.
It's similar to the word pride. Pride is one of the cardinal sins. On the other hand, there's sometimes when you can say, I am proud of, and the Bible uses that phraseology. It all depends on the context. Well, It's the same thing with concern, anxiety, worry. Mm-hmm. Paul uses it positively and negatively.
Mm-hmm. Sort of depends on the context and of the point being made and the object or person being talked about. Yeah. Because we have so many words that are shorthand for several things.
And a matter of degree, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's what's interesting to me is that I would have made this statement. It's not like your mom ever told you need to worry about something more, right? But then as I think about it, I'm like, well, maybe actually she did. Like there were some times in life when I wasn't as focused on something I should have been. And she's like, I think you need to be more concerned about this than you are. You need to be more worried about.
Didn't your mom ever tell you that when your dad's going to get home, you were going to get it? She was planting worry.
Yeah. She said that
Using
a little more
worry.
regularly than I wish she would have. Yeah, right. And so there is a sense in which worry is a good thing. And again, this past Sunday, we talked about how it will prod you to use your problem-solving skills, right? And so we went through a lot of different examples of what that could be. We gave the example of walking through a parking garage and the anxiety or worry that could come up in a situation like that makes you alert. That's a good, valuable thing. We talked about students, that if you have a student who, which right now I've got 3 in my home, if they seem unconcerned about a test that's coming up, my job is to try to get them a little more concerned than they are. Try to get them to care a little bit enough about that, right? And so there's that aspect. You have it over your career or your roles that you have. So whether that's your job and the tasks that you have every day, like what I think we're seeing from Paul in 2 Corinthians 11, where he's saying the reason I'm concerned about this is because it's my responsibility to care about this. This is something God had tasked him with and given him the job of. You also have the worries of roles, okay? And so, I use the example of a father this past Sunday and a husband. We could talk about a mom and a wife who is going to care about her family, and because of that, because she worries, because she's has an anxiety for her family, it's going to cause her to kind of put more effort in, lead better in a more effective way. So moms worry about different things than dads. Okay, so moms are typically more worried about whether the kids are fed, if they're clean. They want to know about the friends that they have and relationships. They're going to care more about the compassionate, the emotional side of things with kids. And at the same time, all of that is going to be good, healthy stuff because that's the responsibility that they've been given.
I remember talking to my wife when she would, in my opinion, be hovering over the kids too much. And in my wisdom, I would say as long as they're not on fire, everything's okay.
It's a very different standard than what she had.
Very.
Yeah. You have any thoughts on any of that?
That's why you need both.
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting little side point here. But yeah, both different aspects of worry and concern together are a much healthier environment, again, for the kid to be raised in. Here's an interesting conversation I think we could have. When does worry become bad? I think that's an interesting concept here, okay? Because we know that it can be unhealthy. We know that it can be bad. I talked about them kind of being on a spectrum where you have a small segment of worry and anxiety that's actually good or beneficial, but that doesn't seem to be the predominant way in which we use that word. Mm-hmm. Usually when we're talking about worry and anxiety, we're talking about unhealthy things. We're talking about bad situations. And so I think it's just an interesting thing to consider. At what point on this spectrum, where does it begin to become bad? And I've got a couple suggestions, and I mentioned one of these for sure within the sermon this past Sunday. I talked about worry and anxiety become bad when it becomes about things that you can't control. And I think that we can follow that even through the Philippians passage, the idea of giving to God the things that he can control. We can't control these things, so why do we hold on to them and worry? Or I think the second piece of that would be when anxiety or worry becomes consuming, when it becomes so, when we become so obsessive about it that it interferes with other behaviors or other things within our life that we ought to be giving attention to. What would you say?
I think the second one is huge. I think the first one depends. I'm looking at the first one and thinking about the year that my son was in Iraq when we started the war, when we moved in. And there was nothing I could control about it. But I was deeply worried about my son while he was there. I'm not sure that was God dishonoring, even though I prayed every day to put it in God's hands. But I've always wondered whether or not my worry at that point was obsessive or consuming, that I couldn't hand it over. On the other hand, I can't imagine how a parent can watch a kid go into harm's way and not be concerned. That makes no sense to me. And so, to me, I think the second one is clear. The first one depends. Another thing that I think when it starts becoming bad worry is when you keep imagining worst case scenarios and playing those out in your mind. Anxiety tends to think, when you obsess over the worst case scenarios when they're improbable. Oftentimes, a person's late and your mind goes, I wonder if he's in a hospital somewhere.
I've gone through time periods where every time my mom calls, I assume it's bad news. Right?
Well, the first time I had a little skin cancer and they told me I had skin cancer, it scared the bejiggers out of me. Now, if it scares the bejiggers out of me the next time I'm told that, then there's something wrong with me. I've had so many of them when I realize it. As long as you catch them early, you're fine. The kind I have, basal cell for the most part. And they're just a nuisance as long as you stay on top of them. Now, if every time I got a statement that I think this may be a skin cancer, if I had sleepless nights based on that, even though my experience was it's going to be fine, then I think there's probably something unhealthy in that. And so imagining the worst case scenarios when they are improbable and obsessing on the worst case scenarios, even though they are improbable, it seems to me that's probably going to be a line that can be crossed.
Another thing is public speaking or performing. Lots of people, I know myself, I've done that quite a bit since high school. And to begin with, it was practically debilitating. Just worrying about what would happen, what all those people would think, and so on. Even these sessions, before they get started, I get a little keyed up. Now, you guys are cold as cucumbers. You got it covered, but I still get a little zapped up.
If you don't get nervous when you preach, there's something wrong with you. I've preached for a lot of years now. When you realize that you're standing up there and trying to represent God, and that you can easily miscommunicate God's word, God's will, and you realize that, what we're talking about is not something as simple as a physical ailment. We're talking about spiritual ailments that have eternal consequences. There are times that ought to blow you over, and to be, I worry about guys who aren't the least bit concerned when they get up to speak when you're talking about preaching. I think a little bit of concern, anxiety there is both normal and good in my mind. Now, maybe a psychologist would smack me upside the head and tell me to behave, but it doesn't bother me to have a little anxiety when I preach.
I would say a small amount. The more I've done that kind of stuff, the less anxious or worried I would say. I would say that there's times that I have, see, again, this is for me spectrum language. There's times when I get up and I preach that I have a concern. And it's not so much about what I'm doing or presenting. It's more about concern about how it's going to be heard or received or making sure that it lands. But at the same time, I would also say, within preaching circles, they'll talk about, you'll have some people who suggest that they can just kind of wing it on a Sunday morning and trust that the Holy Spirit's going to lead them, which we have real problems with. Because one of the things, as we've had these conversations, is you believe that the Holy Spirit can be just as impactful in the study as he can be when you're standing on stage.
Actually,
in fact, he's probably more impactful when you're studying your preparation.
I think asking the Holy Spirit to be with you for 25, 30 hours during the week is going to be more effective than saying, Spirit, I need it right now.
Need you now.
I'm giving you 30 seconds or 30 minutes. Go for it.
I feel
the idea that somehow the Spirit's going to be more active in that 30 minutes than he is going to be in the 30 hours in the study is just stupid.
I would bring about a similarity in our conversation about being nervous or anxious when you preach. I'm often very nervous during the week in my office as I'm trying to figure out how to make this make sense. And I start thinking about Sunday morning, if I'm up there right now, this would be bad news. And so that, again, motivates you to get the job done a little bit different. I want to go back to something you said, because I really want to talk about that top piece, the worry or anxiety about things that you can't control. And you use the example, and again, we talked about this past week or a week ago as we were talking through the sermon and everything else. You use the example of your son overseas in the military and the worry, anxiety that you dealt with. One of the things that you said just now, even as we're talking about, was you said that, on a daily basis, you kept giving it to God, that you kept going back to him and giving it to him.
Kept trying.
I think that's the key, isn't it? I think that's what makes it different than what we would be talking about when it's about the things that you can't control. When you're trying to hold on to it yourself, that would be the unhealthy thing. To suggest that you take it to God and you're worried about Andy today, and then tomorrow you're still worried about him, but you take it to God, I think that's the healthy behavior. Does that make sense? Versus the idea of the consuming nature, the stewing, where you just hang on to it and keep it yourself over time.
And there were some things that we just recognized as being so much more impactful and important in our lives that they take up a lot of time with us, and should.
A child gets sick. I've had both of my children with pretty bad injuries in the hospital, and they're scared to death, and the outcomes could be grievous. And as a parent, if you have no worry, I would worry about you.
Yeah.
No, I think that's the roles and jobs thing. There's places where it's healthy. Even the idea of a long-lasting anxiety or worry. So if you've got a child who has a debilitating illness for a significant period of time, that struggles goes through it. If you've got a spouse who's struggling with health, or if you love someone who has an addiction or a mental health issue and it brings worry and concern to you, to suggest that you can take that to God one time and then it's gone or should be gone and then now you don't have to be worried about it also seems unhealthy.
That's though why the last phrase about things you can't control. I can't control what's going to happen, what they're facing in the hospital. I can. I had no control over what was going to happen to my son in Iraq. Those are things I couldn't control. Now, did it become consuming? Maybe. Okay, so I struggle with that piece. Is it just the fact that I couldn't control and therefore I shouldn't be worried about it? Depends.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also things like empathy that come into the situation. And that and reminders, we wrap all that up together and say that's anxiety or worry. And sometimes part of it is very healthy.
But as you said, the whole idea of keeping on going to God and say, God, I got to give it to you. God, I got to give it to you. Even though I had to tell him that a couple thousand times that year. You're probably right. And that's, as Christians, you got to lean on something. You got to lean on somebody when you realize you can't control. You got to try to hand it over.
Your use of the word empathy was really interesting to me there, with the idea, but it makes complete sense. You think about empathy, and you think about Christian empathy. Even the fact of churches have prayer lists where someone has a problem, and we all choose to concern ourselves with that problem, and we all pray about it together. Right? We take it to God. I think that's probably a healthy example of worry and handling it in an appropriate way, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, most of the time those concerns aren't going to actually affect us. A lot of times they really don't. So if we invest ourselves and become empathetic and in the prayer, that's healthy. That's not a bad sort of worry.
Bearing each other's burdens.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. This past Sunday, we focused a lot out of the passage of Philippians chapter 4 and some things that Paul had to say about worry. Tonight, we're going to do just a breeze through in Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus says some things about worry. There's going to be some similar ideas, some similar takes, but a few other little kind of key ideas that are a little bit different, not different in conflicting manner, but just kind of a different perspective, different angle that'll bring some of this to a different perspective. So we're going to start Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 25. Again, this is Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount. This is him speaking to a large crowd, is recorded by Matthew. And he says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" And I started with this Sunday morning. I asked a question after reading some of Philippians, where Paul says, do not be worried, do not be anxious about anything. I asked the question, do you think he means that? Do you think he genuinely means that? And you go to Paul in 2 Corinthians, where he says that he's anxious about stuff. You look at Paul's life and some of the things he was facing. Is it reasonable to assume that Paul wasn't anxious and he took everything to God, right? And then you look at Jesus' life, and when he's saying this, do you think Jesus genuinely meant these words? Do you think, off the screen for some reason, there we go. Do you think that Jesus actually genuinely communicated these ideas because this was something he was wrestling with himself, right? Jesus had plenty of reasons to be anxious about stuff. There were needs and responsibilities that he had for himself, for his little community. Certainly he had a larger perspective of his purpose on this earth and the direction in which he was going. He had a lot of things to be concerned about, to be anxious about. So he says, don't worry about these things. Do you think he genuinely means it? What do you think?
Jesus used hyperbole a lot. It was one of the classic techniques that he used constantly. And in my mind, I might get struck down, I think this is overstatement in order to make a point. When he says, don't worry about what you'll eat or drink, as a parent, I am responsible to make sure that there's food on the table for my kids. And you talked about it, worrying about whether they'll eat or drink, or about your body, what you'll wear. It's one of the good pieces of worry where it motivates us to fulfill our roles. And so there is a piece of that. On the other hand, some people obsess over what they eat or drink. Okay? Some people obsess over their bodies and what they wear, not realizing that there are things way more important than food and clothes, infinitely more important than food and clothes. I think he is, recognizing that a lot of our worry is rooted in a fundamental distrust of God, a lack of belief in the kind of God he is. So when you say, do I take this seriously? Yes. Do I take it literally? Probably not.
Yeah. would you, if you were to pair this with, which Jesus doesn't go the same direction that Paul does. Paul took that opening statement of do not be anxious about anything, and he leads the Philippian church towards prayer and petition. Mm-hmm. And one of the points I tried to make Sunday morning was that there isn't anything too small to pray about. Mm-hmm. There isn't anything in your life. And you go back to this piece here from Jesus where he's talking about some of the smallest things. Mm-hmm. These are the most basic daily needs. And so in that sense, I guess they're kind of most important or big. But like these are small things of what you're going to eat or drink, how you're even going to clothe yourself, very basic necessities of life. Even those are worthy of bringing to God.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting that so many people put those minute details of their lives on social media, but they don't talk to God about them.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that was like the early days of social media. Remember when that first came out, and the most common thing that people did was they took pictures of their food?
Yeah.
They were always posting what it was that they were eating.
It's one of the reasons that I grew disdainful of social media from the first, and I've never recovered.
Because there's no bigger food critic than you.
I simply don't care what you have for dinner. I don't care about it at all.
What if it's a good idea? What if someone's eating something that you've never thought of that you would just blow your mind and make like be the best thing that's happened?
It's called
to
a
you?
cookbook.
How often do you consult cookbooks?
Have you seen Julie's wall?
How often do you consult cookbooks? Yeah.
Goodness.
Well, it's
when I see pictures of people's food, I just roll my eyes and move on.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
not a chance I'm going to look at it.
Too often it's half eaten, and that just kills the whole vibe.
You guys are way more pessimistic.
And a
about
lot
this.
of that is, here, look what I'm eating. What do you have to eat by comparison?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm eating a bologna sandwich
Seriously?
at home by myself.
Yeah.
Well, I got peanut butter.
You got peanut butter?
There we go. There we go. All right. So again, the big idea, don't worry. He's going to take this even further. He's going to say, look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or store away in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Okay. This led to an interesting conversation I had with Doc a couple weeks ago. I made the comment that birds don't worry, and he said, are you sure? And we had an interesting conversation about animals and whether or not they worry. Interestingly, completely separate from our conversation, I have a son named Baylor. He's 14 years old. If you want to learn things, Baylor is the perfect friend for you to have, because Baylor asks the most ridiculous questions that have nothing to do with anything important all the time. Such as yesterday, we're in my office and he walks, as we're walking out, he says, Dad, why are our ears shaped the way they are? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. Anyways, let's say last week we're sitting in the backyard and he just randomly goes, what do dogs think about? And so we did some research. I don't know, what do dogs think about? And I don't know how anyone knows this, but somehow someone's done some research and we found dogs don't think about anything except the moment. They're thinking about the affection of their owner. They're thinking about food or water or sleep. That's it. Just the current moment needs. But then we read a second article. And it said that dogs actually do have some memories. Mm-hmm. And they do occasionally think back to past experiences, which makes sense because one of my dogs is scared of me. And it's because of things that I've done to the dog in the past. Because she drives me nuts. Sometimes I'm a little bit more forceful with her. So that makes a little bit of sense. And I would say she actually has anxiety. And it makes me so angry to even tell you this story. But we had this dog. We had a friend who was a vet tech up in Indiana. And we were telling her about our dog who wouldn't eat and how goofy she was being. And our friend said, oh, you need some of this. And she got us a medicine, like chews for dogs, because they have anxiety. It mellows them out and makes them chill out. And it made me mad that they exist, and it made me mad that they work, and it made me mad that I was buying them. But all real stuff. So anyways, all of that to say, Doc, I think you're right. I think animals actually do have certain levels of worry and concern, which is, again, very interesting as you pull this back to Jesus, who, again, is probably just speaking in the overstatement, proving the point, the bigger idea, that God seems to take care of the needs of even what we would consider the least important, least valuable aspects of creation.
Yeah, I think the key in this verse is in are you not much more valuable than they? The fact is, God cares so much. If we trust that He cares so much for us, it blunts the force of so much of our anxiety over things that we cannot control. And I think that's the key to this. Because you're right. I mean, I'm right. One of the two. As a farmer, I see rabbits whenever they see a hawk, or you'll see our cats whenever they see a bird or a mice. One of them gets scared, and my chickens around a predator are going to get real squirrely, and so they have their fears. On the other hand, they don't obsess over their food. They don't obsess over their clothing. They don't let those things own them. When you talk about being in the moment, okay? Yeah, in a moment there may be a reason for it. But they don't let that define them.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably some of that in here.
Has that consumed nature, kind of like what we talked about at the beginning, where we become consumed about things. We become consumed about the created things as opposed to the creator. And I think that, again, is where Jesus is trying to turn our heart. Mitch Parker has asked, what was it that helped the dogs? And I don't know, because I never bought it. I begrudgingly pretended like my wife wasn't buying it. But she did find a cheaper version on Amazon. So if you just type in anxiety chews for dogs on Amazon, you'll probably be able to find it. He also asks, would it work on people? And I'm not comfortable trying to answer that. I'm not comfortable trying to answer that.
You'll have to figure out the dosage for the dog and then put a multiplier in for the. No, you don't think I ought to be recommended?
The doctor's saying too much. This is. We are not sponsored by Amazon.
I think it's funny.
Drugs for dogs, and
you got me thinking about dogs thinking, and in my head I pictured a pack of dogs out on the Serengeti, pondering when they could get some chews that would mellow them out.
That would mellow them out. Yeah. That's where we are. All right. Jesus goes on. He says, "Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" And Jesus all the time teaches. This is a rhetorical question, clearly, but I'd love to answer it because we all know the answer is no, but we don't live like the answer is no. There's, I think, so much of the time we become consumed with the worry, whatever it may be, and we let it rule us in such a way that we feel as if we just keep working through that issue mentally, if we just keep rolling around, and I use the word ruminating a lot Sunday, that if we let it just bounce around the head long enough, eventually it's going to create something valuable. And in reality, all it does is it takes up time. It doesn't add a single hour, it takes hours.
What if you flipped it around? Can any of you, by worrying, remove hours from your life?
I've lost hours.
I'm not talking about just wasted hours. I'm talking about the physical effects of anxiety and worry.
Yeah.
Oh, good chance of it.
Yeah. It will. It has deleterious physical effects, biological effects.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You get into some of that kind of stuff, heart disease and everything else. Blood pressure, absolutely. Yeah, that's good. We'll keep going. I found this quote, again, I think it connects really well right in this moment. I used it Sunday morning. Worry doesn't stop death, it stops life. And it doesn't stop today's troubles, it stops today's peace.
It's pretty good.
And I think that's right on the money. I think that's a great explanation for what worry is. Oftentimes we hold on to it again in this idea that we almost hoard worry to ourselves. Like if I just hang on to this worry, somehow this is going to turn into something valuable. In reality, it's not going to bring life, it stops life. And it doesn't get rid of the problem because you've become consumed by it. It just gets in the way of your peace today. And I think that's a really significant way to look at it.
I just wonder how much worrying about something is actually going to affect it. If I'm worrying about the weather, nothing I can do about it. So
no.
And if I would look back at that and say, okay, I've been worrying a lot about this thing, and obviously it doesn't do anything, so you might start to double think how you're doing things, because if you do something over and over expecting a different result, that's insanity.
Yeah.
But again, there's that line. Because if your kid is in the hospital and you're sitting here, don't worry, be happy, there's probably going to be an issue.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, there's something that's communicating a different kind of unhealth.
Someone's going to smack you upside the head, if not God.
Yeah, yeah. Someone's going to tell you you're not taking your child's health seriously enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. Jesus goes on. Skip a few verses, but he says this: don't worry about what we shall eat, what we shall drink, what we're going to wear. He says the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. First of all, big idea here is God knows what you need. I think that's really important for us to hear, especially when it comes to my son overseas in the military, or my child's in the hospital, they're sick, or whatever it may be that you're dealing with in life. I'm in college and I seem to be behind. I'm struggling and I need help. Whatever it may be, okay, whatever you're struggling with, God knows what you need. There should be some comfort in that. It's okay for you to take it to him. He already knows, but it's cool for you to take it to him. The other thing to me that really just stood out to me as I was reading this was that word pagans. And that's really interesting to me. People who don't know God almost should worry. Is maybe like almost like, and maybe not that they should worry, but what happens is that as Jesus followers, sometimes we live more like the world around us than we do like Jesus. I think we can definitely take that piece. And so there's a sense in which sometimes we look more worried and concerned about the things happening in the world, and we look more like the world around us than we do Jesus. And that's not healthy. That's not good. That looks like life without God. Mm-hmm. And so I love this piece. You're looking up language right now. So it says the pagans run after all these things. Do you think there's a sense in which you could even push this further to the idea that pagans justly worry? I don't know.
Well, if you don't believe in God, why not? I mean, you can either be a nihilist and worry about nothing at all, nothing matters, or you can kind of create your own things that you pursue in life, the things that are not necessarily God-centered. Mm-hmm. But if you don't believe in the big G God of the Bible, then worry about what you eat, drink, and wear. What else you got?
Yeah.
And so pagans are going to run after those things. Some of them, and of course, you have some like Diogenes who wouldn't worry about any of this stuff. You know, he made it his quest to be concerned about nothing that he eats or drinks or wears. So you have they can take both extremes, but the whole point is the difference in this is: are you God-centered or are you not? Mm-hmm. If you're not God-centered, then what should we eat? What should we drink? What should we wear? And obsessing over those and raise those up to the top of your list, why not?
Mm-hmm. Balance seems to have a lot to do with this.
Well, sure.
Just another way of saying what we've been saying. You can go to either extreme and do damage, be wrong, or you can find balance, which is something you're going to find in scriptures. Scriptures try to tell us where the balance is.
It reminds me, to some degree, of discussions of grief. Christians grieve, pagans grieve. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between their grief. Mm-hmm. They both grieve. One grieves without hope. The other one grieves with hope. Mm-hmm. And that changes the tears that are cried. Okay? It's the same thing about concern. We're both going to have some concerns, but there's going to be a difference in the kind of concern and the amount to which it ought to consume us as Jesus followers. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so I would try to draw a parallel there, kind of with grief. There's good, but if you worry about things that just simply reflect that you don't believe in a God, you don't trust in God, that you don't realize that there's hope, that what you're dealing with now is not the end of the story. Mm-hmm. If those are the things that mark your anxiety, a Jesus follower ought not go there, to those places. It seems to me anyway.
Yeah. Pagans worry, non-pagans worry.
And what's fascinating,
the difference is where we take it.
And what's fascinating is I did look up that word just out of curiosity, and I wouldn't have, if I were translating this, I wouldn't have translated it pagans. Okay? Now, I understand why they did, and it makes sense, and it's a good translation. But literally, the word is kind of the Gentiles. People of God see it one way. people who are not people of God see it another way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just the word ethnoi, the peoples who are not Israel, essentially is what it is. And it's interesting that they did that because they went for the root here of what we're talking about. You're talking about people who do not wrap their lives around God as opposed to those who do wrap their lives around God. That seems to be the essence of it. So to translate it pagans in this particular context, I think, is actually quite good.
Yeah. Last little piece here from Jesus. It says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things are going to be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. I really like that verse or sentence. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Seek his kingdom first. Our worry is typically going to exist when we haven't submitted to God's will or when we haven't submitted to his kingdom. We're trying to build our own kingdom. We're worried about what's happening in our world, even to the extent of if you press it back towards the military stuff, if you press it back towards your child's sick, any of that kind of stuff, there is a sense in which our prayers still fall back to your will be done. There's a way in which, and I've got a friend from college who lost his life in Iraq shortly after 9/11. He joined the Marines and went over there and lost his life. And I can tell you that there was a lot of good spiritual things that happened for the men around him when he lost his life. That's not what his parents wanted. That's not what anybody was hoping for. It's not what we're praying for. But there is a way in which God's will can still even supersede the plans that make sense to us in our kingdom. It's going back and making sure that we have a mindset that says, I'm going to seek his kingdom first. I think that's really significant.
Yeah,
the other thing I'd point out on this is when you worry about tomorrow's problems, you're just doubling the amount of problems you have today, because today has problems. When you begin worrying about tomorrow's problems, and I think that's kind of where Jesus is going with this. There's enough worry for today. There's enough issues for you to have to deal with today. Don't be so caught up about future or whatever else is happening. Be more focused in that kind of a way.
And we're real good about projecting into the future the terrible things that are going to happen, and the vast majority of the time they don't.
Yeah. You're worried about stuff that may or may not happen. It reminds me of I think I've used this illustration before, but there was this writer that I used to read on ESPN. He wrote these massively long articles every week about NFL football, and he's a really cool guy, but he would venture off into like astronomy and sometimes religion and sometimes politics and sometimes college football. Like, he was all over the place. I just enjoyed reading him. And he would always give a synopsis of each game, a kind of his evaluation of every game that happened every Sunday. And one of the things that he would say, he would talk about a team in a football game that would panic too soon. And he had this line, he used it all the time, and it was almost like a standard thing. And weekly, he put this up, but he would say, don't panic right now. There will be time for that later. And that's always just stuck with me, because I think that's what it is. We worry about these things in the future of what could potentially happen. Mm-hmm. If that actually happens, then there's an appropriate time for you to respond that way. You know, to feel it's too soon. There's going to be time for you to feel like that later. Right. You don't need to feel like that right now.
And you haven't wasted any energy that you'll need at that time.
Yeah. Mitch Parker, again, wanted to know if pagans believe in more than one God. I think this, what we were talking about with the Gentiles and worry, he's talking about just people who weren't followers of the Jewish God.
Yes.
Of God. Then they're going to have their own various gods, some of them multiple gods, some of them singular, but yes, they would have had all sorts of those kinds of
nature,
things.
That kind of
Very few atheists back then. There
Yeah.
might have been a few that came close, but very few were atheists.
And a very different relationship with their God, so that this conversation would be so drastically different, shaped in such a different way.
They didn't wrap their lives around their God in the same way a Jesus follower does. They don't believe about God the kind of things we believe about God. It just didn't work that way. Mm-hmm. Didn't draw a morality from him.
Yeah.
Or they tended to be so capricious.
Yeah, their gods were petty little puny things.
Yeah.
All right, that kind of wraps up that section. I want to be able to dive back into some of the practical application we covered Sunday morning. We got about 6 minutes, and I want to just kind of go through the 8 things that I mentioned Sunday morning, just to allow a little bit more conversation if we want to. The first piece is believe. I think that's so very core and central, because, again, for some people that may not be where you're at, right? Like if you just feel worry and anxiety and you're searching for answers, you're trying to figure out how to become healthier, as Jesus followers, we think that this is a really significant piece. It starts with a belief and relationship with God. It's going to start by understanding and believing that this God who created all things actually cares about you. He knows your name. He cares about what's happening in your life. He cares about the burdens, the worries, the anxieties that you have that you're carrying. He cares, and he can do something about it. He's the one who actually can do things that are outside of our control. He can step into those spaces. I think that's such a huge, key, significant starting point.
Woody Allen is a really smart atheist, and he lives in terror. Not just worry, but terror, he has described. Because if there is no God, then this is a scary, scary place, and life is a very, very difficult thing. Mm-hmm. And so the whole notion of hanging your faith on God, that there is a God, that he is good, that he's got a future prepared, that he's got your back, all of these things, that's going to be one of the biggest foundation pillars for combating worry, anxiety. Without that, kind of good luck.
Sometimes worry and anxiety makes sense if there isn't a
if there's no God, sure.
Yeah,
I think it's important to, when you use the word believe there, to understand that does not require that you fully understand.
No, heavens, no.
And too often
otherwise we'd all be hosed.
We want it proven with facts and evidence, and that's not the level that belief goes to.
Or fixed.
Yes.
Yes. We're just talking about believe. It doesn't mean that you have to get everything, actually do everything right to be able to be in that place.
Exactly.
Yeah. Second thing that we talked about was pray. That was the big piece that we pulled from Paul, kind of the first thing that he mentions. I also used within the sermon at one point the acronym of ACTS, so ACTS. It's adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication, which is something that people tend to use. I really highlighted that piece, thanksgiving, on Sunday, because I really believe gratitude is one of those things that fights against the anxiety and worries that we struggle with.
It's an antidote.
It does.
Yep.
Adoration is also a legitimate piece, because again, that's taking your focus off of yourself and your situation, and you're focusing back on God. That supplication piece can be significant, because that's where you take your worries and your concerns to God. That's the petition part that Paul mentions in the Philippians 4 passage. The confession piece sometimes is why we're worried or anxiety, okay, or why we're anxious, because we know some things that we've got going on. Anyways, that's a healthy practice of prayer, and those don't have to all be equal in your prayer. It's okay to focus in on one of those things, okay? I especially think if you're really struggling with the anxiety, worry kind of stuff, supplication, give it to God, but it's okay for you to spend a lot of time just in focusing on who God is and thanking him for what he has already done.
In fact, if you never make it to the supplication, it's probably been a really good prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's good too. Christian community is really significant in all of this. We mentioned that Sunday. Oftentimes, because again, one of the things that happens with anxiety and worry is it causes us to retreat. It causes us to isolate, which tends to lead us to more anxiety and worry, which causes us to retreat and isolate. It's a vicious cycle that just feeds itself. Community breaks the cycle. And I think again, all sorts of science is pointing to the realities of this. This is the danger of what happened during COVID and the quarantine and the social distancing that we did. One of the most healthy, practical things you can do to break some of those patterns is to make sure that you're connecting into community. And specifically, because we're Jesus followers, Christian community is a very key component of it, because it's going to reinforce that belief piece we talked about. It's going to reinforce that prayer piece that we've already talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when you're talking about this one, the power of a God-honoring touch or the power of a God-honoring hug in battling these kinds of things, it's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to feel like is that empathy piece, that someone else chooses to be worried about something with you and also helps you take it in an appropriate place and deal with it appropriately,
right,
is incredibly empowering.
Yeah,
absolutely. Few more. Exercise was one that we talked about. It's just a proven thing to combat anxiety. There's a spiritual component to that as well, in the sense of you have some New Testament things that speak about how you should care for your body. Probably not the most important spiritual thing. I personally don't pay enough attention to that one, but it is a proven thing that will, again, work against some of your anxiety. We can talk about the volunteer piece. Again, that's all about changing perspective. We become obsessed about ourselves and our struggle. Volunteering causes you to pay attention to the needs of somebody else around you, and be able to speak into them. And there's a spiritual component to that.
Powerful.
You go back into the things Jesus teaches, how we should care for one another. It's the bearing each other's burdens. It's all those kinds of things that we've talked about. Charity, volunteering, compassion for others is a huge component of being
We'll come back to
Jesus.
that one this week on depression too,
Yeah.
because some of these fixes work either way for depression or anxiety.
Yes,
right.
In fact, this next one I know that you're going to mention as well. Journaling was one thing I talked about, and journaling, that's where you practice recognizing your emotions, or you start calling out what it is, and you begin kind of working through and formulating through what it is that you're experiencing. And I know that Doc's going to talk about that sometimes one of the most significant things you can do is actually name what you're going through, to call it by what it is. That's a huge piece that he's going to be mentioning. And again, that's a very spiritual component as well. That kind of goes back to the confession part of that prayer, like what we talked about just a moment ago. The last two, I think, are, again, just so very important. The create an action plan, that's all about that neurological pathways that we talked about. Again, Doc's going to be reinforcing that one this week with depression as well. Just knowing that when I feel anxious, there's appropriate ways for me to respond that are healthy. You have to plan them out ahead of time, set up a course of action so that when it shows up, because there will be troubles. That's one thing Jesus tells us, there will be troubles. So when troubles show up, I'm prepared to handle them appropriately. That's really key. And then finally, seek professional help. Unfortunately, churches have done a lot of damage for people with anxiety and worry by acting or teaching that if you can just pray it away, or that you can, if you were more spiritual, you wouldn't have this problem, or if you loved God more, you wouldn't have this issue. And that kind of thinking actually isn't benefiting people. And so
Causes them to climb up, put on a mask.
Just because the nature of the world we live in, it's very likely that some of you out there have heard other Christian leaders, whether you've been to other churches or whether you just see it on social media or whatever else. You've heard some of those messages before, and it's possible that it's stunting you, that it's holding you back because you need more help. You need us to hear it's okay for you to get more help. It's okay for you to seek out good, godly Christian counselors whose life work is to come alongside of you and help you be more healthy. And so if you're really struggling with this, if you hear nothing else from us tonight, at least hear that.
Yeah, men have a hard time admitting a weakness, but I think it takes a particularly strong, powerful man to step out and say, I need some help.
Absolutely. It doesn't fit with what our culture teaches, but I would agree with you.
Well, we're counterculture anyway, so
we're trying for sure. All right, we went 2 minutes over. I apologize for that. We'll take it from Doc's time next week, and we look forward, hopefully, to see you guys Sunday morning when you join us, and see you again next Wednesday night.
Not a chance I'll give that back.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Night.
See you soon.